The massive temple doors groaned open, and what happened next would change the course of history forever. A young mother clutched her precious baby close to her chest, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and terror. She had traveled for days to reach this sacred place, carrying with her not just her firstborn son, but the weight of an impossible promise she had made to God. This wasn't just any ordinary visit to the temple. This was the moment when everything she held dear would be tested, when her faith would be stretched beyond its limits, and when the very foundations of worship and devotion would be redefined for generations to come. From which country are you watching this video? If you love powerful stories of faith and dedication that will transform your understanding of true sacrifice, hit that subscribe button right now, because you're about to witness one of the most extraordinary acts of devotion ever recorded in human history. Picture this. You're so desperate for something that you make a promise to God that will cost you everything you've ever wanted. That's exactly what happened to a woman named Hannah, whose story begins in the ancient hills of Israel, in a time when the presence of God seemed distant and miracles were as rare as rainfall in the desert. Hannah lived in a world where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to bear children, and she had been barren for years. Every month brought fresh disappointment. Every family gathering reminded her of what she couldn't have, and every glance from her husband's second wife, Peninnah, felt like a dagger to her already wounded heart. But Hannah wasn't the type of woman to give up easily. She had fire in her spirit and determination in her bones. Year after year, she would make the journey to Shiloh, where the tabernacle of the Lord stood, where the Ark of the Covenant rested, where the presence of God was said to dwell among His people. The annual festivals were supposed to be times of joy and celebration, but for Hannah, they became seasons of desperate prayer and bitter tears. Imagine being so broken that your prayers become wordless groans, so desperate that you pour out your soul in a way that makes others think you've lost your mind. That's exactly what happened when Hannah finally reached her breaking point. She stood in the temple, her lips moving silently but frantically, her whole body trembling with the intensity of her petition to the Almighty. The priest Eli, watching from his seat by the doorpost, couldn't hear her words, but he could see her emotional state, and he actually thought she was drunk. The confrontation that followed reveals everything we need to know about Hannah's character. When accused of being intoxicated, she didn't respond with anger or defensiveness. Instead, she opened her heart completely, explaining that she was a woman of sorrowful spirit who had been pouring out her soul before the Lord. This moment of vulnerability, this willingness to be completely transparent about her pain, became the turning point in her story. But here's where Hannah's story becomes absolutely incredible, where her dedication reaches levels that will leave you speechless. In her moment of deepest anguish, she made a vow that would define the rest of her life. She promised God that if He would give her a son, she would give that son back to Him for all the days of his life. Think about the magnitude of that promise. She wasn't just asking for a child. She was essentially saying that she would become a mother only to willingly become childless again. This wasn't a casual prayer or a desperate bargain she might later regret. This was a covenant sealed in tears and witnessed by heaven itself. Hannah understood that true dedication to God sometimes requires us to surrender the very things we desire most. She was willing to experience the joy of motherhood, knowing that it would be temporary, willing to nurture and love a child, knowing that she would have to let him go. The months that followed Hannah's prayer were filled with anticipation and transformation. God heard her cry and remembered her petition, and she conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel, which means asked of God, because she had indeed requested him from the Lord. Can you imagine the overwhelming joy mixed with the constant awareness that this precious gift would one day return to his true father? For the first few years of Samuel's life, Hannah cherished every moment, knowing that each day brought her closer to the fulfillment of her vow. She nursed him, taught him his first words, watched his first steps, and probably told him countless times about the God who had answered her prayers and given him life. Every interaction was precious because she knew their time together was limited by her own promise. The dedication ceremony itself represents one of the most powerful displays of faith and surrender ever recorded. When Samuel was old enough to be weaned, probably around 3 or 4 years old, Hannah prepared for the journey that would break her heart and fulfill her highest calling simultaneously. She gathered the required sacrifices, a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a bottle of wine. But more importantly, she prepared her heart for the ultimate act of letting go. The journey to Shiloh must have been both the longest and shortest trip of Hannah's life. Every step brought her closer to keeping her promise. Every mile traveled reminded her that she was about to entrust her most precious possession to God's service. Samuel, still just a young child, probably didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could sense the significance of the moment in his mother's tears and tender touches. When they arrived at the house of the Lord, Hannah approached Eli with a confidence that could only come from someone who had wrestled with God and found peace in surrender. Her words echo through the centuries with their
power and clarity. As your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood by you here, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition which I asked of him. Therefore I also have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord. Notice the language she used. She didn't say she was abandoning her son or giving him up reluctantly. She said she was lending him to the Lord, acknowledging that Samuel had always belonged to God and that she was simply the vessel through which God's purposes would be accomplished. This perspective transformed what could have been a tragic separation into a triumphant act of worship. The sacrifice of the bull, the offering of the flour and wine, these were just the external symbols of a much deeper internal reality. Hannah was offering her entire life, her dreams of motherhood, her plans for the future, everything she held dear, as a living sacrifice to the God who had heard her desperate prayer. This wasn't just dedication. This was complete consecration of everything she was and everything she hoped to be. But Hannah's story doesn't end with tearful goodbye and silent sorrow. Her response to this moment of ultimate surrender reveals the true depth of her relationship with God. Instead of weeping or clinging to Samuel, she burst into one of the most beautiful songs of praise ever recorded in Scripture. Her prayer in 1 Samuel chapter 2 becomes a prophetic anthem that would later influence Mary's Magnificat when she learned she would bear the Messiah. Hannah's song reveals that her understanding of God had been completely transformed through this experience. She no longer saw him merely as the provider of what she wanted, but as the sovereign ruler whose ways are perfect even when they require incredible sacrifice from his people. She sang about God's holiness, his power to lift up the humble and bring down the proud, his ability to give strength to the weak and silence to those who strive against him. The most remarkable aspect of Hannah's dedication is that it was completely voluntary. God didn't command her to give up Samuel. The law didn't require her to surrender her child to temple service. This was a personal choice born from a grateful heart that understood the principle of giving back to God the very gifts he provides. Hannah embodied the truth that everything we have comes from God and belongs to God, and that true worship involves holding our blessings with open hands. Samuel's life in the temple under Eli's guidance became a testament to the power of parental dedication and divine calling. From his earliest years, he learned to hear the voice of God, to serve in the sacred rituals, to understand the weight of spiritual responsibility. The child, who had been dedicated to God before his birth, became one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history, the bridge between the period of judges and the establishment of the monarchy. The annual visits that Hannah made to see Samuel reveal another dimension of her sacrifice. Every year, she would make him a little robe and bring it to him when the family came for the yearly sacrifice. These brief reunions must have been both joyful and heartbreaking, reminders of what she had given up and confirmations that her sacrifice had been accepted and honored by God. God's response to Hannah's faithfulness demonstrates his character and his delight in willing sacrifice. After she had proven her dedication by giving up Samuel, God blessed her with 5 more children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. Her willingness to let go of one child resulted in the gift of many children. Her surrender led to abundance. Her sacrifice to blessing multiplied beyond her original dreams. The principle revealed in Hannah's story transforms our understanding of what it means to be truly dedicated to God. Dedication isn't just about attending church services or following religious rules. It's about surrendering our most precious possessions, our deepest desires, our carefully laid plans, and trusting that God's purposes are higher than our own understanding. Hannah's dedication challenges every parent, every believer, every person who has ever struggled with the tension between holding on and letting go. How do we love our children while recognizing they belong to God? How do we pursue our dreams while remaining surrendered to God's will? How do we handle the blessings in our lives without becoming possessive of what was always meant to be held in trust? The temple where Hannah made her dedication was more than just a building. It was the intersection between heaven and earth, the place where human surrender meets divine purpose. When she left Samuel in that sacred space, she was acknowledging that some callings are so important they require the participation of multiple generations, that some purposes are so significant they can only be accomplished through willing sacrifice. Samuel's story validates every aspect of his mother's dedication. He became the prophet who anointed David as king, establishing the lineage through which the Messiah would eventually come. He was the voice that spoke for God during one of Israel's most crucial transitions. The child who was given to God became the instrument through which God shaped the destiny of his chosen people. The broader implications of Hannah's dedication extend far beyond her personal story. She established a pattern that would be repeated throughout Scripture, where parents willingly surrender their children to God's service. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, Mary's submission to bearing the Messiah, even God the Father's surrender of his own Son for the salvation of humanity, all echo the same theme of dedication that requires everything. Hannah's example also speaks to the nature of true worship. She understood that worship isn't just about what we say or sing, but about what we're willing to surrender. The highest, the form of praise isn't found in eloquent words or beautiful music, but in the offering of our most precious possessions as gifts to the one who gave them to us in the first place. The dedication ceremony itself becomes a template for understanding how we can consecrate our own lives and families to God's service. It requires intentionality, preparation, sacrifice, and above all, trust that God's plans are better than our own. Hannah didn't know what kind of man Samuel would become, but she trusted that God would honor her dedication and use her son for purposes beyond her imagination. For modern believers, Hannah's story raises profound questions about our own level of dedication. What are we holding on to that God might be asking us to surrender? What promises have we made in moments of desperation that we need to honor in seasons of blessing? How can we cultivate the kind of trust that enables us to let go of our most cherished dreams if God has something different in mind? The temple dedication also reveals God's heart toward children and families. Samuel's service in the temple wasn't a punishment or a burden. It was a privilege and an honor. God delights in using even the youngest among us for his purposes, and he honors parents who recognize that their children have divine destinies
that may require sacrifice from the entire family. Hannah's story continues to inspire parents who struggle with letting their children follow God's calling, especially when that calling leads in directions they never anticipated. Whether it's supporting a child who feels called to missionary work in a dangerous country, ministry that doesn't pay well, or any path that requires significant sacrifice, Hannah's example shows that dedication to God sometimes means releasing our children to fulfill purposes we might not fully understand. The annual cycle of visits between Hannah and Samuel also establishes a beautiful picture of how relationships can be maintained even when circumstances require physical separation. Love doesn't always mean keeping someone close. Sometimes it means supporting them from a distance while they fulfill their God-given purpose. Hannah's song of praise following the dedication ceremony provides a theological framework for understanding how sacrifice and joy can coexist. She wasn't celebrating because she had lost her son, but because she had gained a deeper understanding of God's character and her role in His eternal plans. True dedication leads not to bitterness, but to breakthrough, not to loss, but to a larger vision of what God is accomplishing through our surrendered lives. The legacy of Hannah's dedication extends through generations and continues to impact believers today. Every time someone surrenders their dreams to God's will, every time parents release their children to follow God's calling, every time believers choose God's purposes over their own preferences, they are walking in the footsteps of this remarkable woman who understood that true dedication requires everything we hold dear. Samuel's eventual role as the prophet who would anoint Israel's greatest king demonstrates how God multiplies the impact of parental dedication. The child who was given to God became the instrument through which God established David's kingdom, setting in motion the royal lineage that would eventually produce the Messiah. Hannah's willingness to surrender one child affected the spiritual destiny of an entire nation. The story of dedication in the temple ultimately points us toward the greatest dedication ever made: God's willingness to surrender His own Son for the salvation of humanity. Just as Hannah gave Samuel to serve in the earthly temple, God gave Jesus to serve as the ultimate sacrifice in the heavenly temple. The dedication that began with a desperate mother's prayer finds its ultimate fulfillment in the cross of Calvary. For anyone watching this story unfold, whether you're a parent struggling with letting go, a young person seeking to understand your calling, or simply someone trying to grasp what true dedication to God looks like, Hannah's example provides a roadmap for navigating the tension between love and surrender, between blessing and sacrifice, between holding on and letting go. Her dedication in the temple becomes a mirror in which we can examine our own level of commitment to God. Are we willing to surrender our most precious possessions? Can we trust God with our deepest desires? Do we understand that true worship requires not just our words, but our willingness to give back to God the very gifts He has given to us? The power of Hannah's story lies not just in what she did, but in how she did it. She approached dedication with joy rather than reluctance, with trust rather than fear, with praise rather than complaint. Her example shows that surrender to God's will doesn't diminish us, but enlarges our understanding of His goodness and faithfulness. As we reflect on this incredible story of dedication in the temple, we're challenged to examine our own lives for areas where God might be calling us to a deeper level of surrender. Hannah's legacy continues through everyone who chooses to hold their blessings with open hands, who recognizes that everything we have belongs to God, and who trusts that His purposes are always higher and better than our own understanding. The temple doors that opened to receive young Samuel continue to symbolize the invitation God extends to each of us, to bring our most precious possessions, our deepest dreams, our carefully guarded plans, and offer them as living sacrifices on the altar of His will. Hannah's dedication reminds us that such surrender doesn't lead to loss, but to a life of purpose, beyond anything we could ask or imagine.